Howdy, y'all. I'm Jammer, and well, we made it to number two. So, yeah. Sorry, I couldn't come up with anything to say, but that's just me being honest. And honesty is something I kind of want to talk about today because once I have completed the first one, I was very honest in the fact I said I didn't know if it was going to be a one time thing, if it was going to be a series, maybe it's a limited series. I still don't know what these videos are going to be, but for the time being, I'm just having fun doing them. And on the note of that honesty, I really wanted to talk today about what I wanted this video to be because honesty is important, not just in terms of one on one creation, in terms of a creator and their audience, but then also just in terms of storytelling, period. Time and time and time again, I would begin a story and I wouldn't finish it. And as my life progressed and I began to read more stories, I began to realize the main reason why I did that was because the author didn't really feel like they were being honest, either with themselves, the craft, or the structure, what have you. There was just a lack of honesty with what the work was trying to be. I really don't know how to explain it else than that. It's just that you felt that the author wasn't really trying to be honest with what they wanted or what they wanted the work to be. And that's really crucial when we talk about comics as well, because even though comics is a medium that has been extraordinarily commercialized, there's still a fair amount of work out there that tries its very hardest to be honest and upfront. Even the most glossy, like spectacle induced Batman comic strip has some level of artistry to it, and hopefully some level of honest artistry to it. Anyway, TLDR, today I wanted to try to tackle that idea of honesty and still talk about the medium of comics, and one of the best books to really do that is today's book, One Week in the Library, by W. Maxwell Prince, John Armour, and Catherine Lano. Give you a nice big close-up of the book. And then my iPad is probably going to do funky things with the colors and lights. Ugh. There we go. But yes, One Week at the Library. Now, you might have heard of this book, you might not. It's only about a four-issue run. It's published by Image Comics. This is the same comics company that published I Hate Fairyland. They published Sonata, which is a really, really interesting series that I would recommend, and I actually think I might want to do that one. They also will do a really popular. I'm looking over because if you can, excuse me, Doomslayer. If you look right over here, you'll see a large stack of comics, and those are my Image collection. And along with this book, you also will have Saga, which is a really popular series, and then another big one you might have heard of called The Walking Dead, which is it's a comic. Yeah. But anyway, Image is a more, or at least originally started as a very small independent company that has several commercial titles, but because they have titles like Saga and The Walking Dead, they can also kind of branch out a little bit and give smaller creators an opportunity to make smaller books that wouldn't get put out by big companies like DC or Marvel. One Week in the Library is such an example of a small book because it's not necessarily about a superhero. The title is exactly what it is. It's the week in the life of a library, specifically in the librarian, a man by the name of Alan, who finds himself in the library, which in this universe is kind of this labyrinthian structure. And I mean labyrinthian truly. I'm going to try to find a page that doesn't make the screen go bleh. Excuse me, Doomslayer. Let me move you over a little bit. But you can kind of see just by a couple of cursory pages here, this is not a standard library. And as Alan progresses through the story, he encounters books and individuals like Eyes Gouged Out Man. And no, that's not hyperbole. It's literally a man who has his eyes gouged out. There is another story which involves the character Pinocchio. However, the character Pinocchio is the witness to an assault that he does nothing to stop. There's the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. However, in this case, Goldilocks is a woman named Marigold suffering from depression who's taking antidepressants and doesn't really like her life. Sunday is numbers and math. That's pretty much the best way I can explain that particular chapter. Monday in the book is story of a fly disturbing Alan while he tries to read that eventually bleeds over into kind of like a retelling of Charlotte's Web. Then after Monday, there is Tuesday, which is all about gateways and escapism, and also how, while in fiction, gateways are often realms of new possibility, in our own lifetime, we are kind of caught in a desire for gateways due to the sort of complexity of our own mundane existence. And then, finally, as with all books, you come to Wednesday, which in this case is the end. So that's the book, kind of in a nutshell. And I gave the book that way because, again, honesty, we're staying on theme here. There really isn't a good way to describe the plot line of this book. It's not really built the way a traditional narrative structure is, and that's going to become really important as we get to kind of like my final analysis of the book.
Tea. I mean, I'm just saying, like, if we had real production values, I wouldn't have to keep filming this thing on a flipping iPad. We'll talk later.
So, I've talked a little bit about what the book is about. And like I said before, describing the plot of One Week in the Library is a little difficult to explain. A coworker, when she read the book before me, also had difficulty explaining it. I work in a library, she works in a library, and she at the time worked resource services, which means she got to process all the books first, which means she got to process and read this book before I did. But fun fact, if you work in a library, you're more or less contractually obligated to read any and all books or materials that have the word library in the title. I read it, and my coworker didn't really think much of this book. Honestly, I thought it was brilliant. Like, I really loved this book, even if I was left a little perplexed by it. But since that time, I've read this book about 3 or 4 times, and I actually just finished it the other day, and when I was thinking about what should my second video be, I went to this book. Because, and this, well, you know what? I'm jumping the gun. Let's talk a little bit, though, about kind of where this book sits today. Like I said, it's kind of a smaller book. It has not exactly jumped to the forefront of public knowledge. Very few people probably are even aware of this book's existence, which is sad because it's a good book and it's an interesting book. But again, because it's not really told in a sort of traditional narrative, it's going to be probably difficult for a fair number of people to really approach reading this book. But I don't want you to think that nobody's ever heard of it, because I actually discovered a resource while I was trying to do some research for this, and there's a website called Comic Book Roundup, and I think what I'm going to do is try to post a link in the description section below to the Comic Book Roundup collection of reviews for this book. Because what it does is it collects various reviews by critics, what have you, who then more or less rate books on a scale of 1 to 10. Now, looking at this one, the predominant score was about a 9, and when you look at some of the people who have written it, and of course on my cell phone, it doesn't give me the actual reviews themselves, well, what have you. A wide variety of comics publishers or comic critics have written about this. One particular one that I'm a big fan of, COmicsocity, a friend of mine, Michael Greenhale, works for them, and they actually wrote a review of this book and gave it a 9. Collectively, critics have given this book a 9, and a lot of people have written a lot of really interesting things about it. The problem is they're approaching it probably the same way that I am, which is that structurally, this is an interesting book. Narratively speaking, this is an interesting book. But in terms of just a general story, it's probably going to leave a more casual reader kind of frustrated. But we should probably talk about why that is, but then also why I think this book is really important to talk about in terms of the medium of comics. I moved him. He was kind of getting in the way. But I wanted to show him off. He's just so gorgeous. And again, I wanted to be honest. Hey, I bought a Doomslayer doll. I think he's awesome. Yay! Anyway, let's talk about One Week in the Library and how it contributes, I would argue, greatly to the comics medium. So, in the first video, we talked a bit, my chair's creaking a lot as always, about this book here, Understanding Comics, by the ever-impressive Scott McCloud, right? Well, also on the back, let me get up close so it stops. There we go. We talked a little bit about how comics work. We have the man wearing his top hat. There's a gutter between the panels. Now the man's taking off his top hat. This is the story. We have 2 images
juxtaposed in a deliberate fashion to tell some kind of narrative.
In terms of the medium, 1 Week in the Library definitely adheres to that, as you can clearly see just from looking at one single page. We have panels, moving images from place to place, time to time. Story is being told in this fashion. But, and this is something I really didn't talk about last time because there's so much to talk about in understanding comics, and I really need to do just like a chapter-by-chapter video of it. Ideas for the future. But something that's really important is that images don't always necessarily have to be purely sequential. Again, when we're talking about stories, sometimes it's important to sort of shake things up a bit. You don't have to show a character moving from point A to point B to point C to point D to point E to point what have you. Sometimes you can just go from point A to point Z because all those materials between point A and point Z don't really matter. Or if they don't matter, they're not important to this specific story. And you can probably cut to any movie or comic that you've read beforehand. Montage sequences are probably the most sort of like culturally recognizable example of this. 1 Week in the Library is a lot like that because as Alan moves through the library, he will move from scene to scene, day to day, week to week, and transitions in this book can be very strong. But it also at play here is that there's a lot of play in this book. There's not always just a concern of just arranging the panels in just a kind of just basic block order. The artist John Amour and Catherine Leno really play with the form, so that on the one hand you'll have a more traditional structure right here of us following the word boxes and the text, what have you, but then right here we have prose in the book. At this point we have to ask a question, or do the prose in its entirety count as a panel? Well, at this moment we kind of have to say yes, and there's actually several pages of prose in this book. And the prose is where we actually read the story of Goldilocks, aka Marigold, a woman who's suffering from depression, having difficulties with her medicine, her boyfriend, what have you. And it would seem at first that that's the most experimental play here, but again, like I pointed out earlier, there's also something else in this book that's really interesting, and that's the use of infographics. Now, if you don't know what an infographic is, you probably know what it is because you've probably seen one. It's more or less, there's a fancy pants term called data visualization. It's usually charts. So if you ever had to do like science fair projects in high school or middle school, you probably had to type stuff into Microsoft Excel, make a chart, what have you. But we also now have things called infographics where people will compile data and then will include visuals like animals, humanoid figurines, to add sort of more layered definitions to the data so it comes across as kind of a pretty picture. And there's multiple examples of infographics contained within this book. It's not just even in this chapter by itself. So at this moment we have a combination of the comics medium with prose with infographics. So you can see just in 3 issues alone, we already have a lot of dramatic, or at least from our perspective, dramatic, not alterations, there's just a lot of play going on in this book. And in terms, at that point, of the comics itself, we do see a lot of interesting choices being made. You can see here the slow movement of Charlotte's web, the ultimate reveal, Wilbur's response to it, and then on the very next page, we're able to observe the reaction to Charlotte's, well, we'll call it an editorial for the time being. If you want to pause it, I assumed you have already. Okay, you've seen it. It's a very sad story. But this is another great example of how comics can work when artists are really trying to play with the medium and really observe how you can arrange images in just the right way. These 3 panels right here of the terrible, and even if you'll note, we don't even get the whole word. We get T-E, we get R, and then we kind of get the L-E, and then we finally see it. Terrible. Now, I'm looking at it kind of like a mirror version here, but you can still nevertheless get what I'm trying to show you. By giving us tiny bits and pieces,
we eventually gain an impression of, wait a minute, there's something off here, and then we move down to this wider panel for the reveal, and then this wide panel down below helps create an emotional reaction. That's just one page, but that kind of shows you how comics can work and how 1 week in the library will often play with the medium. This book is filled with slow, gradual reveals like that. And again, usually what he's trying to do in these individual stories is tweak traditional narratives. Like I said, we have Goldilocks and the Three Bears, a story about a woman suffering from depression. At the very end, Alan throws her books to the bears. In this story, we have a fly bothering Alan. The fly gets... Well, technically speaking, the fly is part of this long, complex process involving a bird who gets super weak, and then Charlotte catches the baby bird and eats it. And it's a pretty morbid retelling of the story. But nevertheless, what we have in this book is a lot of kind of tweaks on traditional narratives. And this chapter, I'm not going to dig too deep into it, but we have, in this moment, a pretty interesting examination of portals. And I'm also going to throw this out here as well. I think there's an interesting sort of meta-narrative in this part, because again, Alan is looking or meditating on entrances and gateways, and I'm just going to go ahead and read a little bit of it. Please try to imagine something pretty while I try to sound interesting and cool. So on Tuesday, I pursue the alcove of porous borders. It's here, among millions of stories of escape into fantastic places, that I believe I might find a way to break free of the library's grip. Porous borders. Flimsy edges that allow transition from one world to another. A thought. Isn't that all books? Isn't that, by definition, every story? An answer? Yes, of course. But these are special. These stories show the way. They're blueprints. For instance, a wardrobe and also certain armories can be used to travel from place of grief and tedium to a land of magic and wonder. The same goes for looking glasses, unassuming mirrors, and the burrow holes of rabbits, opossums, and mischief-inclined beavers. And then finally, and this is to say nothing of the transporting power of prescription medications, organic hallucinogens, and particular binding agents. The fumes of some glues have been said to reveal secret realms upon deep inhalation. And then I see it, a thing both strangely familiar and completely, utterly foreign. A border, porous and yielding. A way out, one can hope. So, again, this book, in terms of its narrative, it's not exactly a traditional story. Alan is not always an approachable character, and in fact, oftentimes, he's kind of a mystery to the reader, because most of his story is him wandering around the library, discovering books, which, trust me, from somebody who works in a library, that is a fair amount of your job. But he's often going around finding these books, getting sucked into these stories, or reading the stories, and then kind of reacting to them, and sometimes kind of not. Oftentimes, this book is kind of more an exploration through a bunch of ideas and through a bunch of stories, and Alan is this kind of combined... He's kind of this combined figure of, he's a sort of a placement for us, the reader, but then he also is kind of a place for Will Prince, the writer of the book, and then also just this third abstract character who's constantly being exposed to these ideas and meditating on the role of books. And then one last thing before I kind of get to my final point why I think this book is really, really cool. If you look at what was just read, again, it starts off with Alan finding like a big crashed pile of books in the library. He picks one up, Methods of Practical Travel, Volume 16, and he starts to read. Now, again, he starts talking about porous borders and meditating on how books, more or less, are these borders. Again, it's books like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which opened so many imaginative young minds during the World War II years. The book Alice in Wonderland, a book that, while it has unfortunately received many awful movie treatments lately, is still a fascinating idea in terms of its imaginative approach. Again, a gateway can be everything, and of course, it's still pretty new and pretty relevant, but The Matrix opened up a wide variety of possibilities for narrative techniques, or at least an examination of how prescription medication, or medications period, can dull, or in some cases, awaken our sense of reality. But then Prince and Armor and Leno, I'm probably butchering those names, please forgive me, do an interesting thing with this panel right here. Because at this moment, we see a door. And again, we've noted that all these are in some sense a doorway, but now we have a door inside of a panel on a page in a book. And so I think you could argue, and I'm definitely going to argue because I think it's a really cool idea, is that every panel of a comic book in and of itself becomes some kind of porous border. Every comic book has a panel, and each one of these panels is a way for us to sort of transcend our reality and go into a world we never thought we would experience before. Sometimes these are going to take us to absolutely fantastic places. Other times it's going to take us someplace incredibly, well, mundane. Which I kind of feel like this is some kind of meta commentary on like indie comics in general, because a lot of them, and I've read a fair number of them, are boring and depressing. But there's going to be several on this channel, I promise you that. But also, too, it's a way that comics can be a way for us to find new worlds, even if these worlds are familiar. And so what's really beautiful to me about just that one section of the book, and now I'm kind of geeking out, is that you kind of have a meta commentary that has a lot of interesting things to say just about how comics can work. One panel can mean so much, because it can be a porous border to a world you have never even imagined before. But all at once, you're there. He's back. Anyway, there's one last thing in this book that I really wanted to talk about, and that's this kind of final summation of the book in terms of what it's trying to do with narrative in comics. Now, it's not necessarily a new technique, but in the final chapter of the book, the library that Alan has been exploring begins to crumble around him, and at one point he encounters a book who says, "The answer's in my guts." Alan picks up the book, and then he's taken out of his book and into the air quote real world, where he actually gets to meet W. Maxwell Prince, the author of this book. You can see right here a copy of the graphic novel. Well, what follows next is Prince essentially takes Alan around the neighborhood and talks to him about why he decided to tell this story, why he started writing, and why he loved comics in the first place. And there's actually, again, to tie with a theme that I originally had, is there's a concern for honesty. Now, I'm going to have to read again. I promise. It's the last little bit, but it's important. He says, "Welcome to Brooklyn. Like in the stories? I wrote you, Alan, because I want people to think I'm smart. It's true, I've got this. I'm afraid, no, I'm terrified of people thinking I'm dumb or dull, or even worse, averagely intelligent. I thought maybe that writing a comic about a library would give the reader the impression that I'm a bright guy, because the alternative that I'm not is too scary for me to contemplate." And then he goes on to say, "I realize how absurd it sounds, but it's the truth. This story, it isn't about you, Alan. It's about me and all my stupid, self-destructive little hang-ups and neuroses." Now, the next panel, they go to a bar, and Will confesses a little bit more, but then he also talks a little bit about his motivations and stories, period. Now, you'll note there's one panel here where we see a very strange-looking bald gentleman, and Will points out the name Grant Morrison. Now, I haven't read it myself, but a good friend of mine, Michael Siegler, who's the co-owner of Ground Zero Comics in my hometown, has read Grant Morrison's run on Animal Man. I really can't, overstate how important this comic book was. It came about during the 1990s. And it's an amazing, powerful, wonderful book. But what's important is that at the very end of the series, Animal Man, the superhero character, gets pulled out of his book and encounters Grant Morrison, who then tells him, "You're the main hero of a comic book that I wrote." And again, this isn't anything new. Writers have used this trick before in the past. If you've ever read Stephen King's Dark Tower series, he makes several appearances in his own books. And then there's writers like Kurt Vonnegut, David Foster Wallace. This isn't necessarily a new trick, but when Animal Man came out, it was one of the first real times we'd seen that in comics. Up to that point, Stan Lee would have never written himself into a comic book. Jack Kirby would have never written himself into a comic book. Neil Gaiman wouldn't have even written himself into a comic book at that point. Nevertheless, Grant Morrison did it. And that's one of the things that kind of helped seal the deal for Grant Morrison's Oddity. Now, I kind of feel that Seaguy, Sebastian O, and Flex Mentallo might have done a little bit more to secure the reputation of Grant Morrison as odd, but then he writes stuff like All-Star Superman, and I'm like, Grant, I love you, man. Anyway, what's important for 1 week in the library is that Will kind of points out at first how he perceives him basically pulling this fourth wall trick, or there's another particular, yes, self-insertion. He feels at first, or confesses, that he thinks that this is a cheap trick. But again, he has a lot, or confesses to a lot of insecurity to Alan. He confesses the whole point of the story was to cover a lot of his insecurity. And then at the very end, he's like, you know what? I need to stop doing that. And you know what? Sometimes when we talk about stories, sometimes we like to have happy endings, sometimes we need sad endings, and then sometimes maybe no ending is better than anything at all. And the book literally ends with that. Will returns Alan to the library and abandons the story. And again, it says at the very end, the end, I guess. Now, admittedly, some people would probably call that a cop-out, and some people would say that's just lazy writing. And the first few times I read this book, I did kind of feel the same way. I was like, really? Like, you kind of had this interesting idea here at the very end. You could have given Alan a little bit more humanity. Why just walk away from a story? But at the same time, if you take a step back and just consider the overall form of this book, I really think that Will's creative decision here makes a lot of sense. What's really interesting about 1 week of the library is it's not really a story of Alan. Alan is just the figure in which the reader is sort of focused on, or he's the point where we follow a lot of these ideas and momentary small stories. Or maybe to put another way, Alan kind of becomes this framing device. Now, if you don't know what that is, if you've ever seen the movie The Princess Bride from the 1980s, the grandfather reading the book to his grandson, that's a framing device. It's the way to tell the whole story, but have the structure that holds it all together. And there's tons of different writers that have done this. It's a way sometimes to connect a lot of independent, separated stories. Maybe a more popular example would be The Crypt Keeper from the 1980s TV show. You had this Muppet character who would introduce all these little independent horror stories, and it was a way of having this large story connect all these little smaller tales together. And in terms of 1 week in the library, you have a combination of, we've got a bunch of little stories, and then at the same time we have the sort of framing device figure, and then at the very end we have honesty. A writer begins a story, he puts it in the library because he says he wants people to think he's smart, and then at the very end he's willing to confess to a deep insecurity, which is, I want people to think I'm smart. And maybe it's just that's where I'm at in my life. TLDR, y'all don't need all the details about it, but in the last year there have been a dramatic amount of changes. I've spent a lifetime suffering from depression. I've started taking antidepressants. I feel better because of it. In the last few years, I've been in a very bad marriage. I recently got a divorce. It still sucks. I'm still dealing with the blowback from it. Day by day by day, it's a struggle, and I'm trying my best to just stay strong with it. I am an individual who tends to suffer from a lot of loneliness, and especially right now in the time of COVID-19, where we're all sequestered in our homes, it's really bloody difficult, yo. I mean, granted, Doom helps dramatically, but nevertheless, I have those. And on top of all that, there is that beautiful line in this book. I, in my own life, have wanted people to be smart. I've wanted people to perceive me as intelligent. That was partly because growing up, the people that I liked and admired tended to be intelligent people, or at least seemed to be intelligent people. And it's one of these things in life where I have spent so much time working and trying to appear smart. But one of the nice things about getting older is realizing that no matter how smart I may become, there's always going to be somebody who's going to be smarter than me. I may be able to explain the nuances inherent in the medium of comics, but I can't change a tire. Somebody does. Somebody knows that skill. Somebody knows what a spark plug is. I don't know what the flip a spark plug is. I couldn't even tell you what a spark plug looks like. I'm being honest, because I have mad respect for people out there who know what spark plugs are and how they work and how they use them, and more power to you. The point is as you get older, it's important to be honest with who you are, what you can do, what you can't do, and then most importantly, to be real and be honest with what you can and can't do. Looking at my life, I have spent a lot of it wanting to appear smart. And in that time, I've acquired a great deal of intelligence. But thankfully, fortunately, I've also acquired the little fragment of intelligence which reminds me, be humble about it. And make sure that you're not just being smart for the sake of being smart. Be smart so that you can help the people around you and so that you can help yourself become a better person. So, what the flip does this have to do with this graphic novel? I would argue a lot. It takes a lot of courage to start a story and then, kind of like right in the middle of it, go, you know what? I've done what I need to do. I've gotten out of the story what I've gotten out of it. I'm out. Walking out of a story may at first seem like a cop-out ending. But again, if you really approach this book from the perspective of, we're going to tell a bunch of little stories about stories, we're going to sort of play with a medium that tells stories, and at the very end, we're going to throw a little bit of honesty at you from the point of the creator to somehow kind of wrap this whole thing together and create some kind of aesthetic statement about stories and how they work. I think this book is brilliant. It's not always the most approachable book out there, and I'm not going to give you any 10 out of 10 because I'm not that person at all. What I am is somebody who loves comics, and I love this comic. I guarantee you I'm going to read this book 5, 10, 15 more times before I finally die, and every time I do, I'm probably going to get something new out of it. So, if you can, hit up your local comic book shop, and I guarantee you, again, this is an Image book. You're talking the same company that puts out Saga and The Walking Dead. I guarantee you, your local distributor can probably get you a copy of this book. So go to your local comic book shop because, Amazon has enough money right now and comic book shops are hurting. So hit up your local comic book shop. If they don't have it, they can probably order it for you. And if you can't go there, hey, check out your local library. Just a thought. Okay, well, thanks guys, or guys and gals, people, non-gender specific individuals, whoever you are. I think you're awesome, and thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. I went a lot longer on this one than I thought I would. I'm going to try to keep these things as short as I can. But it's me. I like to geek out, and I like to show off my statues. So, whoever you are, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed it, please do the like, share, and subscribe. It helps me out tremendously. Predominantly because it means you're actually watching and I have an excuse to keep making these. And then if you have suggestions for comics that you think are awesome, or if you have just comments about this book, or hey, you want to make fun of my ugly teeth, I mean, they're kind of there. Go ahead, do it. But please, just leave a comment below. I would love to hear you. Thank you so much. I think you're awesome. Go read some comics.